My husband of 26 years just passed away 4 weeks ago. I am no stranger to grief. If you follow me, you know I've lost 3 children over the course of 17 years. And my husband's death is hitting differently. I want you to go in the comments. If you've lost a spouse, can you just kind of share, how does it hit you differently? I'll tell you, my first real encounter with grief was when my adopted son, Johnny, died in 2005 in a drowning accident. And, I think I handled that the way a lot of Americans handle it. But then there was a series of, kind of medical trauma around my son. And then my son died in 2016, my daughter in 2021, and now my husband. They had this disorder called DRPLA, which is an acronym for denture papillonian atrophy, right? It is a genetic disorder. We did not know my husband had it. My son started showing symptoms first. And so when I say that my husband's death is hitting me differently, when I have all of this experience in grief, and if, follow my story, go to the other playlists on grief, I have really shared my journey on how do you actually grieve. There was a lot of anticipatory grief around my husband. We had already lost my son Reggie to DRPLA, my daughter Maya to sudden unexpected death in epilepsy, which was directly related to her DRPLA. And so we were preparing for his death for a very long time, for years. And I remember when my son died in 2016, we truly believed that my husband would be next, right? He was already having trouble walking, eventually ended up in a wheelchair. And so some of you who have lost a spouse, you knew it was coming. There was this anticipatory grief around it. You had time to prepare. But some of you who have lost a spouse, it happened suddenly, an accident, an aggressive type of illness that happened quickly. So how does it hit differently? If I look at all of my grief and I lay it out on the table, and we have Johnny in 2005, Reggie in 2016, Maya in 2021, my husband in 2024. When I lay all of those out, I have to be honest that Maya's death was the hardest because it was so unexpected. She seemed so well. I thought I knew what DRPLA was. I thought I knew how the progression happened. And so I believed that she was nowhere close to death. I thought her progression would be similar to her brother, who was very, very sick towards the end. And so when I talk about my husband's death, I really have to talk about anticipatory grief. And maybe some of you that are watching have a husband with Huntington's or Alzheimer's disease or, some sort of cancer, and you're their caregiver. And that's what I was to my husband. And so there's these mixed feelings. It's hitting differently. It's when you lose a spouse, there's an identity of now you're a widow. You're alone. And the expectation of what that means, probably specifically for a wife, maybe it's different for a husband who has lost their spouse. But it's kind of, I'm going internally and I'm trying to grieve. And I look back at the grief, the intensity of the grief that I felt for my children. And I still sometimes feel. And I have a whole documentary on that. And I've written a small ebook on how to grieve. So that will be in the descriptions if you're interested in that. So I have lots of experience in grief. And I have this thing that I call controlled grief. And in controlled grief, I do just that. I take control of the grief. And I say, okay, I'm going to sit and I'm going to look at pictures. And I'm going to allow myself to cry. And I'm going to allow myself to miss. And I realize as I'm doing that with my husband, I've been doing that for years. Ever since the diagnosis of DRPLA struck my family, and that's, it took them several years to find it in my son, Reggie. And we knew that it came from one of us. And when we found out that my other daughter and my my husband, all had DRPLA. I have been fearing this for the last 12 years of I'm going to lose all three of them. And so I don't know if it just hasn't hit me yet. And so this is my advice to people that are going through this. And this is why it's so important for me to continue to share while I'm in it, right? A lot of my work is, created as I'm going through something. And it's been this 1 month from my husband's death. There's this expectation to kind of be able to be normal, function. I am not feeling the intense grief that I should be feeling, right? And get away from shoulds, right? Have grace for yourself. Especially I know people who have lost a spouse that their kids are young, right? And I remember when I lost Johnny, like everything was about caring for his sisters, right? And so I know that if you have young children and you've just lost your spouse, that's all you can think about is how do I do right by my children? So have grace for yourself as you're going through this process. The death of a spouse is an identity change. And, our identity should not be in our spouse, but there's a portion of it that is. Many of our friend groups are as couples. All of my friends loved my husband. And there's a part of that everything changes. Every interaction changes when you lose a spouse. Every, friend group, relationship that you have with other people. And so as I go through this process and share with you, coming from a place of really understanding how to process grief, and now just losing my husband, I'm going to give myself grace in that it is hitting differently. So share in the comments how you think losing a spouse hits differently. I'd love to have some conversations around that. My name is Christy Bundikumara. I am a psychiatric nurse practitioner. I have over 20 years of clinical experience, but my real experience, as you see, comes from navigating my own grief and trauma. I have lots of videos, and I love to share the grief series with you. As many people who have watched this are either trying to support someone who's lost a husband or have lost a husband. So, thank you.